So welcome. I'm Dan Off with the National Bureau of Asian Research. NBR is a nonprofit think tank committed to informing and strengthening U.S. policy towards the Asia-Pacific. I'm delighted you're all here with us today for Engaging Asia 2019. Let me also welcome those who are live streaming, joining us by live stream on YouTube. In case you've wandered in here looking for the Michael Cohen testimony, I should let you know that's across campus on the House side. But I'll also give you fair warning that that hearing, in my opinion, is only the second most consequential event happening on Capitol here today. The first, of course, is our Engaging Asia event. So what is Engaging Asia? So Engaging Asia is a dialogue. We bring members of Congress, industry representatives, Asia experts to discuss the road ahead about U.S. policy in Asia. So of course, today we're going to discuss over the next few hours some of the key issues hitting the headlines, the U.S.-China trade war, the Trump-Kim summit, but we also want to do a deeper dive into the drivers and brakes that help shape policy behaviors in the Indo-Pacific. So let me briefly outline our run of show. So first we'll hear from Congressman Ted Yoho and then Congressman Rick Larson on what they view to be the most important issues occupying their attention in the Indo-Pacific region for the 116th Congress. Next, we'll have an expert panel, former congressional, State Department, Department of Defense experts to discuss key functional and regional issues that dominate U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific. Finally, we'll have a conversation with Deputy Representative C.C. Chen, who will offer his views from Taiwan on trade policies for the Taiwanese government's engagement with Congress and in the region. None of this would be possible, of course, without our sponsors, so we just take a moment to thank Chevron, the Korea Foundation, and Pragmatics for your support in making this possible. It's your support that we're able to continue to do what we do, which is to inform the Hill and policymakers. Let me also thank my colleagues, Ali, Claire, Roy, for their important roles today, as you'll see them in our discussion. Let me also thank the one person who's as responsible for this event as probably I am, which is Dan Lee. In case you've interacted with Dan Lee or me, Dan Ong, you may have wondered whom you were interacting with at some point. Let me tell you, the answer is both. At this point, we've worked so long on this that we've created a mind meld on Engaging Asia. And so, if anything's gone to him, it's gone to me. And then finally, let me thank our great senior events manager, Audrey Mossberger, without whom we wouldn't have great events like this on a regular basis. So without further ado, let me hand it over to my colleague, Ali, to introduce Congressman Yoho.
Thanks very much, Dan. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you all Congressman Ted Yoho. Congressman Yoho represents North Central Florida's 3rd Congressional District. And of particular relevance to us here today, he served as the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Asia in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and served last year in the last Congress as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. Congressman Yoho has, for a long time, been a strong and vocal supporter of Taiwan throughout his time here on the Hill. And as Dan mentioned, we'll hear a little bit later from the Deputy Representative from Taiwan. He also recently, last Congress, introduced and led the charge to pass the BUILD Act, which streamlines and modernizes U.S. development assistance and is a bill that is of particular relevance and importance to the Indo-Pacific region. So we might hear a little bit more about that later today as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Congressman Yoho.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Wow, the microphone that works. This is good. It's an honor to be here, and we appreciate the National Bureau of Asian Research for hosting this event. It's an honor to join with you in a discussion on this important role Congress plays in engaging Indo-Pacific regions. For the past 6 years, I've had the privilege of serving on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm passionate about it. We just had a meeting this morning with Madeleine Albright. Told her we welcome you to the most important committee in Congress. And I truly believe that because if you have good foreign policy, if you have strong foreign policy, you have strong trade economy, you have a strong trade policy, you have strong economic policies, more importantly, you have strong national security policies. And these are things that we want to put in place that live beyond us if they're done properly. And I really feel that way. As a ranking member of the subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, and non-proliferation now for the 116th Congress, I look forward to working with my colleagues to oversee and expand U.S. engagement in one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. I'm going to change that to the most important. Because if we look at the Indo-Pacific region, and you put a dinner plate over that area, there's going to be more people living in that region by 2050 in the world than outside of that. So this is something that we all need to pay attention to. Since I last addressed this organization, NBR, Engaging Asia's event 2 years ago, a lot has changed. I didn't even use the term really wasn't spoken about, Indo-Pacific in my remarks, just wasn't used a lot in 2017. But since the Trump administration has adopted a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which will help to create an environment conducive to democratic ideals and free market economic growth throughout the region, it's just so important that we put our emphasis on that. As we make policies, the important shift has been welcomed across the political spectrum and brings the United States into greater alignment with how our key allies are approaching the region. The implementation, targeting, and follow-through on this strategy is going to be a major priority for the committee in this Congress. And I dare to say it's a strong bipartisan feeling. Also, in the interim, since we were here last and talked, a lot has happened. We've had 2 summits with North Korea. The BUILD Act, as you talked about, and I appreciate you bringing that up, that's been passed and signed into law, even though a lot of people said it would never happen. And this is something that we take a lot of great pride in, but it wasn't just us. We had great support on the Senate side. We had great support through the administration, and it was a strong bipartisan bill. And I'm a guy that came up here to get rid of foreign aid, as a lot of people know. But what I soon learned is you can't get rid of foreign aid. If you can't get rid of it, what can you do? You can reform it and make it better, and that's what our goal was. And so I'm going to deviate from my notes here, and I know that's always a dangerous thing when you have the people that write your speech, because they never know where I'm going to go. But I think I know this area very well. And when we look at the world today, we're going through the largest tectonic shift in world powers that we've ever seen since World War II, certainly in my lifetime. I'll be 64 in April. And so it's a change I've not seen since World War II. This country, the world has not seen. And so what we're seeing is rising powers, we're seeing competing powers, we're seeing more conflicts in the world, although there's not been wars, there's not been world wars, thank God. But I think it's fair to say we certainly haven't been without conflicts. There's over 70 million refugees from the Middle East crisis and what's going on in the Baltics that we've not seen that many since World War II. Then you throw in the Western Hemisphere. Over 3 million people, or right at 3 million people, have vacated Venezuela. There'll be an exodus in Latin America if we don't get things calmed down. And I don't want to say we as Americans, we as governments around the world. Then the other thing that I see going on, I think is very dangerous, is the competing types of government that are coming out. And of course, I'm talking about China. China offering their alternative to Western democracies, being socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I've been very critical of China. I've been very vocal about China. I've stood up strong for Taiwan, for Hong Kong, for the ASEAN bloc of nations. When you have a country that says, we're going to offer an alternative, socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that country says CCP, Chinese Communist Party, to me, it's a communist platform. They call it what they want, but that's what I see. And when I hear Xi Jinping in 2017, October 2017, saying that the era of China has come, no longer will we be made to swallow our interests around the world. It's time for China to take the world center stage. Being from America and hearing that, it feels very threatening. And we shared this when we were in Hong Kong. We shared this with pro-Beijing people and anybody else that was there. And I think this is something, when nations start talking about, we're going to take the world center stage, that's only going to happen at the expense of another nation. And I think that's a concern for all of us when it comes down to foreign policy. And certainly our goal is not to take anything from China. We applaud their success, but not at the expense of another nation, not at the coercion or the robbery of intellectual property of another nation, or a trade imbalance of $367 billion between the U.S. and China. And I can't fault an administration, but that's something that happens through negligence and neglect over the last 40 to 50 years in this country. This country should never have, its leaders should never allow that to happen. And then I look at the Indo-Pacific or the Asean Nations, the 10 blocks of countries that account for 653 million people, roughly $2.5 trillion in trade. That is an economic powerhouse. That is a powerhouse of individuals, of think tanks, of entrepreneurs that are developing. And like I said, that area of the world is going to be more people living in that area by 2050 than outside of that area. And so what we should all work for is policies that facilitate the success of another nation without the coercion of what we're seeing. And again, I've been very critical of China because I've seen their policies. I've seen what they've done in Sri Lanka, taking over a port in Colombo, to where they've leveraged financing that the country couldn't pay back, so they take strategic ports over. And when I look at the progression of China with blue water ports in the Indo-Pacific region, in Africa, both ends of the Panama Canal, they want to compete against Singapore, and I'm all for competition. But you have to wonder, when the leader of the nation says it's time for us to take the world center stage, I don't know about you, but it gives me a little bit of concern that maybe we need to do something different. And when you see the claims that the Chinese have made to the East Sea or the South China Sea, the arbitrary 9-dash historical sailing lines, I think any other country could probably say the same thing. And then when they get challenged in the court of arbitration and they lose the fight to the Philippines, they ignore it and they move on. They build land masses, militarize them. At the same time, their leader is in Washington with President Obama in 2015, claiming they will never militarize those land masses, yet at the same time they're doing that. So actions don't meet up with the rhetoric, and I think that's what concerns me more. And so we've talked to the ASEAN nations, and I understand their pact is, and I respect it, is one nation never interferes with the politics of another. I respect it. I think more of us should be like that, including our country. But I think when it comes to a point where you're seeing an aggressor in that region that is using military, not force yet, but they're using the buildup of a military, saying this is our land, and claiming sovereignty to the sea lanes, to the airspaces. Again, I think that's a concern. It shouldn't be just for America, it should be for everybody. And as I implored Prime Minister Lee, that I think it's time for the ASEAN nations to stand up collectively, because one nation is not strong enough to stand up against a strong China. We're not strong enough by ourselves. But collectively, the 10 nations, 653 million people, and then Canada said, we'll stand, and then the UK and French, United States, India, South Korea, Japan, and Australia said we would stand. And I asked Prime Minister Lee, if we don't do it today, if this is not done today, is it going to be easier or possible in 5 years? The response was it won't be possible. And again, my goal is not to interfere with China's success, but I do not want it at the expense of another nation. So what do we do about that? How does foreign policy come into that? We can certainly, our recommendation is to incentivize countries or companies to go anywhere but China for manufacturing. And we can do that through our tax code. Other nations can do the same thing. We passed our American Tax Cut and Jobs Act that lowered our corporate tax rate to 20%. Companies are coming back. And again, I do not want to take anything away from China. But when I talk to the ASEAN bloc of nations, and I asked them what made ASEAN so successful as a trade hub? They said it was the United States. It was the involvement of the United States bringing rule of law, honoring of contracts. And I don't think that's too much to ask for any nation in a crowded world that we're becoming, very crowded. And there's going to be competition for minerals, for petroleum, for natural resources, for food. And I think we need to all learn to play respectfully together. We can have our differences as nations. And I think our policies have gone way too far, and I've been very critical of our own policies, that we go in there and we tell people in different countries, you've got to expect human rights and all these things that we believe in this nation. But we'll go to another nation and we'll say, oh, you've got to do these things in order to get our support. We alienate people through our policies. Yes, we believe in those policies or those principles, but understand it's taken us 200 and some years to get here. And when you go to a country that may not believe in what we do, I think we need to be tolerant, encourage people to come this way, but more importantly, show them what they can achieve with an open society. I'm not threatened by China's push on their form of government, and I'm blessed, and I hope you guys feel that way too, in America, that we've, from our founding fathers and our principles, our rights come from a creator, not from government. Government's instituted by we the people. If we hold those beliefs true and it's protected by the Constitution, our form of government empowers people. It empowers people to achieve, and the government's there cheering you on. Where I see what China is doing is suppressing the people because they fear liberty and freedom. Because the highest entity in the Chinese government's thinking, Communist Party, is there no higher entity above the Communist Party. And so their goal is to suppress the people, do not challenge that. Whereas all you got to do is look on Capitol Hill. Somebody's being challenged every day. Yeah, it is a mess. And, our form of government is messy. And I think Ben Franklin said that very adroitly when he came out of Constitutional Hall, when that lady asked him, "Sir, what kind of government did you give us?" He says, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." It is messy, but I think it's well worth it. And it's something that I don't want to force it on anybody, but I don't think you have to. If you show people that if you empower people, the greatness that can come out of them, and it moves them on, not just as an individual, but as a society, and hopefully a calmer world. We're seeing way too many conflicts in the world. I don't know how you guys feel, but I'm sure you feel the same way. With that amount of people that are being forced into refugee status around the world, you're seeing what's going on our borders, you're seeing what's going on. There's got to be a better way. And we're just happy to be here at this point in time in history. It was an honor to be able to get the Build Act, and I appreciate the work this organization does, and for your attendance here, because some of you work for members of Congress or the Senate, you're with the press. Get this word out, and understand, all I want is people to move along, grow their countries, help their people out, and with that, I'm going to be quiet, and if you want to go to the question and answer, I can do that, and they're going to let me know when votes are called. They're being called? Oh, right. When did they call? How much time we have? We got plenty. Any questions? Right here. What's your name? Who are you with?
My name is Dong Yu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong.
Okay.
Yeah, and Congressman, yesterday you said you want to see Vice President Pence to go to visit Taiwan.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have proposed this to Trump administration. What did you have?
High levels with Secretary Pompeo and the Vice President.
Okay. How did they respond to you?
We haven't gotten a response yet. As my wife says, no response is a response. But we're going to keep pressing that because I think it's important that we recognize it. And I don't know if you guys are aware, I wrote an editorial that was in Taipei News or Taipei Times. It's time to recognize Taiwan for the country it is.
Considering its significant implication for U.S.-China relations, these two big powers right now is competing. So, do you think it is feasible to realize this kind of visit?
Yeah, I do, because this is something, if we ignore it, Taiwan will be consumed by China. You know, I think there was a bad policy done by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon in the 70s, one country, two systems. You know, prior to that, Taiwan was recognized as a country. And today they have their own military, they have their own form of government, their own economy, they're a democratic nation. And we shared this with a foreign minister from China. He probably wasn't real happy with it, but I told him I'm going to be very open, very blunt, very honest, and I expect the same out of you. Applaud Taiwan for what it has done. You know, they're an independent nation, and I think the majority of the people in America would feel that way. I know I do. Applaud their success, and it's like a child, not to call Taiwan a child of China, but it's one of your kids. They don't do what you want to do sometimes, but they become successful. You don't want to take their success because, oh, you didn't do what I wanted you to do. I want to applaud their success because I'm proud of them. Look at the benefits that have come out of there. Technology, medicine, you know, the SARS epidemic. Taiwan was the one that led that, yet China forces them out of the WHO. This is wrong. This is something that you should applaud that, because we all, as a world, and we're going to a global society, and I prefer not to, but I think we should applaud that success and benefit from it. And so, yeah, I think President Trump ought to go there. And we're in support of President Tsai coming here. Ma'am?
Hi, my name is Caroline, and I work for Madeline Albright at
Okay.
Albright Stone Group. And my question is about artificial intelligence race between China and the U.S. So when we're up against a country like China that has data localization laws and loose privacy laws, so they have and access to data for millions of people, how should lawmakers help U.S. companies and industries remain competitive, especially because China on the national and district level that they're pushing incentives for these companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent to innovate and develop artificial intelligence.
This is something that's I think is very close to a lot of us. We're very concerned about this. This is something the government should intervene with, put more money in R&D across the board, whether it's biotech, space, artificial intelligence. This is something that's imperative, because we're competing not against a Chinese company, we're competing against the Chinese government. And then you hold in mind what Xi Jinping said, that it's time for them to take over the world, pretty much the center stage. So I think this is something we need to put more money into it and go out and empower our industries through research and development, whether it's through DoD, through our research universities, but also make sure that the technology they're developing is not going out to another country, because China didn't get ahead or get to where they're at by, I'm going to say, fair play. I think there was a lot of, we know theft. We know that. We know there's intellectual property theft of over $600 billion that were going on. I don't mind head-to-head competition, but when people start cheating and doing underhanded things, it's not the way that we should play in the world. And again, it goes back to what Asean said. It's been successful because of the rule of law that we honor and respect. And China's culture is based on honor and respect. They need to get back to that. If not, they'll enter another century of shame. You know, that'll be recorded, maybe not now, 50 years from now or 100 years from now. And I don't think that's what Xi Jinping or the people of China wants. So empower our businesses to do that, but protect their intellectual property through our trade practices and through things like CFIUS. Robert Pittenger's that he put up, ma'am. I hope that answered somewhat close to what you're looking for.
Congressman Captain Delfino from Roche,
This is
Pennsylvania.
your last question.
Okay. You said, and I think thank you. You said, I think accurately, that when Beijing lost the fight against the Philippines in the UNCLOS, they ignored it. But so did Manila ignore it after that ruling came down. What are your thoughts about the current U.S.-Philippine alliance?
Well, if Manila was out there building and militarizing islands and then claiming that sovereign nation, I would fight with them. I mean,
But
but
Manila,
China has moved in there and has, according to our satellites, military barracks, offensive and defensive weapon systems, and military radars.
right, but Duterte put that aside, and so my question is, what are your
Oh,
thoughts
you meant
about?
they ignored it and let them go?
Yeah, they ignored it too, so
Right.
what are your thoughts about the U.S.-Philippine?
You know what, I think if we're gonna have world order and world peace, we need to have world standards that we adhere to. If not, you become chaotic, chaos leads to disruption, and, you know, some people say chaos is the normal for the universe. Out of chaos comes, order, and I forget that theory, but it's not the way I wanna live. So, you know, if Manila ignores that and they're okay with it, that's okay for them. But when China says, all right, we're gonna move ahead anyways, we're gonna make a sovereign nation, and don't dare to tread over us. I think that's dangerous, not just for us, but for the world with the amount of trade that goes through there. Appreciate it, you've been a great audience. We'll be back next week. No. Take care.
Thank you, Congressman Yoho, for your insightful, candid remarks. So trying to bring a little bit of order to the chaos, we have a slight schedule adjustment. So Congressman Larson is on the floor for vote soon. And so I asked our expert panel to come up now so we can initiate that, and then Congressman Larson will come after the panel.
Yes, sir.
So we'll jump right into it. I had the distinct pleasure of hosting a similar type of panel for the second time in the past 4 months. So this is actually the second type of panel that we've held on these types of issues. So the first was in December of last year, where we previewed for a private Hill staff group on what we foresee to be the key issues in the Indo-Pacific related to the 116th Congress. We received some feedback. Our experts here, with the exception of Francisco Picosme, who's missing, but we have the great addition of Ms. Catherine Del Pino, authored a series of commentaries, which you may have picked up from outside. They go into great depth with concision on what the key issues both will be and also what they should be if they're omitted for Congress in the 116th. And so, let me briefly introduce our experts. So Frank Januzzi is the CEO and president of the Mansfield Foundation. He's a longtime congressional hand, having served as the senior professional staff member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was also at State Department's Intelligence and Research Bureau, and he will discuss geopolitics. Next, we have Walter Lohman, who's the director of the Asia program at the Heritage Foundation. He has also formerly worked on the Hill on the Republican side for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff for the then ranking Republican member. He also teaches at Georgetown, specifically on the role of Congress in Asian policy. So third, Lindsay will join us shortly. She is the director of the Political Security Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute, the Richard Polk Fellow, and the Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office. She's served at the U.S. Department of Defense as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian Pacific Security Affairs, and she also worked as a consultant for the Congressional Research Service. Maybe you're catching a trend. And then finally, we have Catherine Delpino, who is Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University. She was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And she was also a career officer with the Asia Foundation and the Foundation's representative for Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. So without further ado, let me kick it off, hand it off to Frank to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Dan. Do I need to push pause?
Yes.
I've so rarely been on this side of the witness table. Many years, 15 years at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, sitting behind the members, and we never got to have the little fancy box with the lights and the red, yellow, and green. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Dan and NBR, for the invitation to participate in this panel. Thanks to Walter and to Catherine, old friends, as the Chinese would say, Lao Pengyo, old friends of mine for more years than I would care to mention. It's my job to sort of kick off and give you a little bit of the macro view of the 116th Congress in Asia. And I really want to riff off of Congressman Yoho's remarks, which I found very interesting and I think nicely encapsulate a reality of U.S. thinking about the Indo-Pacific region, which is it's all about China. China is, without question, the rise of China, without question, the defining strategic event of the 20th century. To me, more significant even than sort of the world wars has been the rise of China, the movement of 500 million people out of abject poverty into a situation of a better life, and the emergence of China back on the global stage as the #2 economy in the world, some say #1 already, and a growing military and political strategic influencer across the globe. And how to think about the rise of China has long been an issue that was before not only presidents of the United States, but also the Congress. And Walter and I were present at the moment when the Senate and the House had to consider the issue of China's accession to WTO and how the United States would respond to that and the extension of normal trade status with China. And I think it's fair to say that the United States made a bet at the early part of the 21st century that China's integration into the global economy would be a good thing for China and a good thing for the world. I don't think that was the wrong bet, but I think that some of the consequences of China's growth have been different than those that we assumed, and I think that some of the assumptions we made about the impact of China's economic integration with the world, the impact that we expected that would have on China's politics and China's global behavior, have proven to be incorrect. And so the 116th Congress confronts a China that's very different from the China that I first encountered in 1997 when I joined the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That China was a China that was not yet a dominant global trade player, a China whose bilateral trade volume with the United States was only a couple times greater than our bilateral trade with Taiwan. The situation has been so dramatically transformed in such a short period that it's no wonder that the entire world is having a little bit of a shock to the system. So what I want to just mention before moving to a couple of other challenges is that this rise of China has been met increasingly in Washington with skepticism bordering on hostility. And that was not always the case. For most of China's past 4 decades of Gaiga Kaifeng, reform and opening up, China's integration into the global economy, China's enmeshing itself into all of the international institutions and systems was viewed with a favorable response by Washington. In fact, we were encouraging it. And it's really only in the last 10 years, as the United States has looked in the rearview mirror and seen this rapidly approaching Chinese vehicle behind us, that we have begun to change our attitude. And it's partly because of what China has not done, that China has not sustained a path of political liberalization and reform over the last decade. And it's partly by what China has done. As Congressman Yoho referenced, militarization and island building in the South China Sea, a much more assertive posture on the global stage, a mercantilist trade policy that many people view with suspicion. My caution to the Congress and to the audience is that we should really follow the words of Ambassador Wynne Lord and neither demonize China nor sanitize China. The last thing we want to do is to assume that China's rise is synonymous with our demise, the world is not a zero-sum game. On this, Congressman Yoho, I think, seemed to be trying to walk a fine line. He said that he had no problem with China's modernization and rise as long as it did not come at someone else's expense. But in saying that, I think he was implying that maybe China's rise was coming at our expense. I don't think it is. I don't perceive it to be a zero-sum game, and neither I think the Congress should perceive it that way. But I do believe that the United States needs to look really closely at where our interests align with those of China. We have a great degree of alignment on issues like climate change, on issues like preventing global conflict, on issues like denuclearizing North Korea, but also where our interests do not align. And so I think that we need to take a clear-eyed look at China that neither demonizes nor sanitizes them. And in all of the areas where China faces real challenges, they have an aging population, they have pollution problems, they have energy shortages. The United States should view these as opportunities. We have technology and knowledge that we can bring to bear on some of these really important strategic challenges that are facing China, and view them as areas of potential cooperation rather than adversarial relationship. My time is almost up, I think, but let me touch on the other couple of issues that are most critical, I think. One is, of course, North Korea, and President Trump and Chairman Kim are off in Hanoi right now. We're going to see something tomorrow. I'm going to reserve judgment. I think it's always a good idea to wait until you actually see what agreements are reached and the dust settles before we reach conclusions about whether the summit was good or bad. I will say that I think the skepticism in this town about North Korea's denuclearization is probably well-founded. But on the other hand, I think that the alternatives to the peace and denuclearization process that President Trump has launched are grim. As imperfect as this process is, and as frustrating as it is going to be, I prefer it greatly to the alternative of either military action or indifference to a growing North Korean nuclear threat. I think at the end of the day, we need to also not lose sight of the fact that the future of North Korea is about more than the future of the Korean Peninsula. It's really about the future of Asia writ large. And I like to say that, to some extent, how the North Korean situation is resolved will determine the true border of China. Will the border of China's influence be the Yalu River, the 38th parallel, or Pusan? And if the United States misplays this situation, it's going to be Pusan. A united Korea or a confederated Korea is going to align itself largely with Beijing's interests if we misplay our hand. And if we play our hand well, and if we hold to our principles and we stick to our allies and our Korean and Japanese allies, and we work for the actual denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, even if it takes a long time, then I think we have a reasonable shot at a unified Korea someday in our future that would be aligned with Western values of market economy and democratic principles and respect for human rights. So the stakes are very, very large, and we are at a pivotal moment even today, and we'll know more soon. Finally, let me say, I took my bird over here from my office. The Menstrual Foundation, we have a commitment to go carbon neutral by 2020. We're buying carbon offsets when we travel. We're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. The unstated crisis which is upon us, it's already here, it's in evidence, is global warming and especially sea level rise that is going to accompany this. 3/4 of the population of Shanghai, that's 24 million people plus, will be underwater by 2030 with the current level of sea rise. There are about 150 million people across the Asian littoral region, Mekong Delta, Irrawaddy Delta, Yangtze River Delta, who live less than 3 meters above sea level. All of them are at risk. We're talking about a human catastrophe on a scale that we have not witnessed. Hundreds of millions of people having to leave their homes, trillions of dollars of assets destroyed. If the Congress doesn't take action now, yesterday, we will all regret it, and nowhere will the impact be greater than in the Asia-Pacific, which is, as Congressman Yoho rightly pointed out, a place that matters more than anywhere else. So if the Congress isn't concerned about climate change, it should be. The science is absolutely solid, and the sea level rise is already happening. should all be on our birds and off of our cars. Walter?
Thank you, Frank. Walter?
Thank you. Thank you to NDR for having me here. As Frank said, we're all new friends here on the panel. You I've known for quite a long time. Frank commented on the table. I also was thinking about it when I sat here, because I thought one day I might be seen on this side, facing this way, but that's the way history goes. You know, it just wasn't meant to be. Well, I wanted to just hit on 3 points here about the U.S.-Asia economic stake and U.S. policy in regards to trade with Asia. The first thing is how important Asia's growth and economy is to the United States. I think we lose track of that sometimes in the day-to-day debate over what we're going to do about China, or what China has done lately, or the headlines about China's imminent collapse or anything else. The truth is that Asia is an ever bigger part of U.S. of the global economy, and it's going to continue in that direction. It's going to be ever more important to the United States, and it's going to be ever more important to every other country in the world. The U.S. isn't the only country in the world that's pivoting to Asia. The Europeans are pivoting to Asia as well, especially in an economic sense. And as you see them pivoting in an economic sense, you see their growing equities in some of the political security issues as well there. If you look within Asia, countries in the region have an ever-growing stake in their relationship with China on the econ side. China is the leading trade partner of Japan, the leading trade partner of South Korea. South Korea by far. South Korea trades twice as much with China as it does the United States, leading partner of Asean. All that to say that the U.S. isn't going to change that equation. And an attempt to fight that reality is only going to isolate the United States in the long term. There's 2 significant things I want to point out about this, the impact that it has. Number one, American leverage on the economic side is not what it once was. That's not admitting defeat or anything. I mean, in fact, it's admitting success, that our economic policies and our engagement with the world have helped it grow the way it has, and helped China in particular grow the way that it has. But it also means that our leverage is not what it was, say, in 1985. The second thing is that the region is going to continue to grow, it's going to continue to prosper, it's going to continue to build linkages and connectivity among itself, within the countries within the region, as well as externally, with or without the United States. We're not going to change that. We're not going to change that either. And you can see that happening. You can see that in the CPTPP that the Japanese went ahead with, along with the Australians, really pushing that along. You can see it with the agreement that the Japanese have now with the Europeans. Very big agreement and a great consequence to the United States. You can see it in the ASEAN agreements, any number of things. The region is moving on, whether we pull out of TPP or not. I mean, if we pulled out, the region's not going to stop for us. The second point I wanted to make was about U.S.-China trade and the talks that are ongoing right now. I think it's very important that these talks succeed. I think you have a couple different camps that are following this. There's some people who are following it very critically, actually don't want to see it succeed, want to put the metrics for success so far out there that it can't possibly meet them. I mean, for instance, you hear a lot of talk about how, well, USTR is never going to get the Chinese to structurally change their economy. No one is talking about structurally changing their economy in 90 days. Even with the additional 60 days, you know, maybe we won't be able to do that. We're talking about discrete policy changes that we can enforce and we can build on in the long run. Changes in things like their investment climate, changes in their JV requirements, the mechanisms that are in place that enable them to coerce U.S. technology, addressing cyber threat, getting them to better enforce the law on cyber threat, IPR law, same. So there's a whole range of things we could talk about a little bit in the Q&A, but I think when we talk about structural reform, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. We're talking about getting a down payment on beginning to address those things in a very real way, long term. Frank talked about the bet that we made with the WTO, that eventually admitting China to the WTO and giving them TNTR would help encourage political reform in China. I agree that prosperity was never going to lead to that kind of reform in China, and that's something that I think was misstated 20 years ago. But what's still true is that economic freedom will lead to political change in China, and I don't think that those two are distinguished the way that they should be. They're two different things. You can have a certain degree of prosperity, especially starting from a low base, and not have economic freedom. China is getting to the point where it needs more economic freedom. I don't think it's a coincidence that political freedom and economic freedom have both declined in China at the same time, especially over the last 7 or 8 years. I'm encouraged by the progress that the administration is making right now on agreement. I think if agreement with China, I think if you listen to what they're saying, you listen to what President Trump is saying, you listen to Bob Lighthizer, they are making progress, and I expect, I do expect an agreement at the end of the day, one that will be substantive, more than just a few deals on soybeans and the rest, and will give us a way to work for the future. Again, something else we can talk in Q&A if you'd like. And then the third point I wanted to make was about the need for a positive vision on the U.S. side when it comes to trade. So much of this administration has been focused on correcting imbalances, correcting trade deficits, addressing unfair trade agreements. I mean, set aside the fact that the trade agreements are really not unfair, but okay. Addressing trade agreements, changing the trade agreements, making them more advantageous to the United States, enacting tariffs on 232 grounds or on 301 grounds. We need a positive vision as well. And to the extent that the administration has talked about one, it sometimes couches it in negative terms, and then hasn't done very much to follow through on it. Probably the biggest pillars of this or parts of this proactive approach are free trade agreement with Japan, moving forward with Japan. The problem is that the Japanese don't really want it. Whatever they may be telling us now officially, they don't really want a trade agreement with the U.S. They've been squeezed into getting this to this point. I think for good reason, because they don't want to go through the same process that the Mexicans and the Canadians and the Koreans went through. They're watching that, and they're kind of wary of that. But maybe more importantly, they've already made a lot of concessions in the context of the TPP negotiation. They don't want to have to go through that again at a bilateral level. And then on top of that, you have the fact that we're going to be running out of time on this administration in a couple of years, and so why would you make some big bets there? You have the Philippines, possibility of agreement with the Philippines. Just to be as direct and sort of efficient as possible, as long as Rodrigo, the President of the Philippines, never going to happen. And then you have the case that everyone's agenda is full. You know, on the U.S. side, Lighthizer's agenda is already stacked. He's got agreements that he has to negotiate with the EU. He's got Japan. He's got all these various voluntary restraint agreements that he's negotiating with people under the threat of countries with the threat of imposing tariffs. He's got USMCA he's got to get through. If you look back at the Obama administration, they had to do TTIP and they had to do TPP at the same time, and that was unbearable. I mean, that was impossible, and in fact, we stalled on the TTIP, so it's very difficult to do. And then on the Asia side, you know, we think of ourselves so much as the center of the world, and we are in so many ways. But they got other things going on. They got other stuff to do. They got more promising prospects with CTPP. They got, you know, they're negotiating new members of that. They got a trilateral agreement that's on the way, or at least under negotiation between Korea and Japan and China. They've got agreements with outsiders as well. So they're kind of fully stacked in terms of their outreach and their negotiating ability. So it's going to be very hard to get to that. So we've got to push that positive agenda even harder. I'll leave it there. I look forward to Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Lindsay, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you all, and my apologies to NBR and everybody else for joining you.
You were on time. We're scheduled.
Joining you late today, but I'm going to talk a bit about U.S.-ASEAN relations and U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia, which I have to commend NBR. I'm really glad that you took on this topic in this compilation because, one of the points that I want to make today is when we talk about U.S. policy toward Asia, even if you just kind of scan the headlines on a daily basis, Southeast Asia rarely makes it into the headlines unless it's like this week where it makes it into the headlines because they're hosting the North Koreans, right? So usually if you hear about Southeast Asia, it's often in the context of China or it's in the context of some other big priority like this week, North Korea, but rarely on its own merits. And I actually think that's a big problem. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has been a U.S. partner for over 40 years. But my guess is if you went up to the average person on the street and asked them what ASEAN was, we could even go more specifically, if you found the average staffer on Capitol Hill and asked them what ASEAN stood for, would they know? I think a lot of people, the answer to that question would probably be no. And that's unfortunate, because Southeast Asia is a region that has enormous geostrategic and political and economic importance for the United States. It also is a region, it is the largest destination for U.S. investment in Asia, ASEAN collectively. I doubt many people know that. It has 5 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies. And equally important, it's got almost 400 million citizens under the age of 35. What does that tell you? It's a region that's going to be even more dynamic and important in the future. It has strategic sea lanes, it has growing military capabilities, and countries that can contribute on issues ranging from counterproliferation to international peacekeeping. So in sum, it's a region we ought to be paying a lot more attention to. There are, however, I think right now, in U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia, and specifically with ASEAN, some potential friction points that are going to be challenging in thinking about how to build relationships in this region in the next few years, and I want to highlight a few of them. The first is that right now, Southeast Asia has been, for the last couple of decades, a bit of a good news story in the world and in the region when we think about democratization. You had a lot of countries that were formerly authoritarian that had really sort of turned into flourishing, vibrant democracies. And in the last few years, we've seen backsliding on this in a number of different places. You've seen crackdowns on free press, eliminating independent press outlets. In some countries, just a movement toward military government, restrictions on free speech, human rights abuses. There's a number of them. And I think that as the United States is thinking about how to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, it becomes very challenging to think about how you engage more broadly and successfully in a region where these are widespread problems at the moment. More importantly, I also think that when you have the potential for lack of transparency, corruption in government, we've seen in multiple instances, and I would just point more recently to the example in Malaysia, where you had government corruption that China helped enable and took advantage of in some places. So I think it's particularly important for the United States to think about how we help countries advance a more transparent, accountable form of governance. The second thing that I would point to is there are growing signs that people in Southeast Asia are increasingly pessimistic right now about U.S. leadership, and that has changed notably over the last 2 years. So there's recent polling that just came out, surveyed Southeast Asian experts. Nearly 60% of the participants said that U.S. influence had deteriorated or deteriorated significantly in the last couple years, and almost 70% of them said they had a lack of confidence in U.S. commitment and reliability. It will be extremely difficult to convince countries that they ought to sign trade agreements with us, that they ought to sign up to partner with us on things like preventing North Korean proliferation, if they fundamentally don't actually trust that we're going to remain around and that we're going to be reliable partners for them. The third, ASEAN has struggled in recent years with its own consensus-based model of decision-making and the fact that they don't have a lot of consensus at the moment, and this is something that China has exploited fairly effectively. As small countries, 10 small countries in Southeast Asia, where ASEAN's real strategic significance comes in is its ability to serve as an independent, autonomous actor in the region, and to provide something of a counterbalance, and ASEAN states can't do that if they can't find a unified voice. And I think the United States, in particular, hasn't done enough in this respect to actually help countries in Southeast Asia find that unified voice, find an autonomous, independent position that they can take apart from China and Chinese influence. And finally, I would say it's not at all clear that when we talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific and how we view our strategic priorities in the region, that the United States and Southeast Asia are on the same page a lot of times. When I talk to friends in Southeast Asia, they're focused on priorities like natural disasters and climate change, like Frank mentioned. They're thinking about things like human trafficking, like trafficking of weapons, countering violent extremism. These are huge priorities in the region. And they hear from us that what we want to talk about is strategic competition. And my friends in Southeast Asia say, hey, by the way, that didn't work out so well for us the last time around. And so there's a lot of concern that right now the United States is moving towards a foreign policy that's essentially going to be a with us or against us type of approach, and that they're going to be stuck in the middle. So looking forward, what can we do? What specifically could Congress do here? First, I would really encourage the administration to think about articulating its commitments in Southeast Asia and to our Southeast Asian friends, more specifically on their own terms. Help people understand why this part of the world matters, not simply as sort of an instrumental element of our China policy. There's a proposal on the Hill for a Southeast Asia strategy for the administration to have to write one. I would strongly encourage folks to support that legislation because I think it's extremely important. Second, Congress can really help the United States keep its commitments in Southeast Asia by leveraging the power of its purse. I hear a lot of times people are like, that's great that you say you're a Pacific power, but, where's the money? And they don't see it, and they see it going to other parts of the world. And I think if we can't back up our rhetoric by actually making our budget match what we say matters, people are going to have continued doubts about how much we really care. Third, Congress could really focus on putting more money toward good governance and human rights projects in this part of the world. It's great that we are looking at how to enhance our military budget, but there's a whole lot more that could be done in terms of development assistance and our diplomacy and diplomatic efforts as well. Then finally, I think some of the greatest potential for stronger engagement with Southeast Asia lies in the fact that it has a very large, young, dynamic population. The Obama administration started a program called YSEALI, the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. When I go to Southeast Asia, it is every single time the thing I hear is most popular and most appreciated about U.S. engagement in the region. We need to be thinking about how to do more of that kind of engagement with our friends in Southeast Asia. More scholarships for young Southeast Asian students to come to the U.S. and encouraging more U.S. students to go to Southeast Asia and learn about what's going on there. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lindsay. Catherine.
Thank you. In this horse race, I'm the substitute jockey. I'm here to represent Francisco's paper, which happily I think is a great paper, but also to add some views of my own. I want to talk a tiny bit about the policy climate in terms of human rights countries to watch, which the paper also looks at, and to expand on his own very good list of recommendations with a few of my own. Francisco has, I think, think, a very masterful statement in his report in which he says, and I quote, "The free fall of priorities in the administration comes at a time when the rights landscape of the Indo-Pacific has rapidly deteriorated." That's very diplomatic, but it's also very hard-hitting. And what I think he is saying is that this administration has not demonstrated concern for human rights in the same way that some recent previous administrations have. I agree with that. I'm not saying the administration doesn't care about rights or that they haven't occasionally demonstrated concern for them, but this is probably the first administration after the mid-1970s that has not tried to have a consistent and comprehensive human rights framework. And whether you subscribe to the Carter Doctrine or the Kirkpatrick Doctrine or anything in between, all of the other administrations after the mid-1970s at least tried to have some kind of comprehensive vision. And the net result of that is that it falls to Congress to be a little bit more vigilant, a little bit more active, and to look to make sure that some things don't fall between the cracks. And I'm going to make some suggestions and recommendations for what I would call synergies, which is a kind of strange word, for some of the administration's priorities where rights can perhaps be strengthened. The second is countries to watch, and Francisco says, of course, North Korea in terms of rights, China, Myanmar, primarily for their Rohingya, and also India. To that, I would add the Philippines, one of our treaty allies, Cambodia, a country in which we had invested a lot of attention and treasure 20 years ago, and depending on what happens this year, possibly Thailand. Thailand has a lot on its plate. It's going to be quite an acrobatic affair to get an election and a coronation and sharing ASEAN all in the same year, but I think the potential is there also for some increased rights abuses beyond those that we've already seen. All of Francisco's recommendations about empowering and strengthening human rights networks and supporting human rights activists in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region, I think, are solid. But I would add about three things. One is I think that there are opportunities that might resonate with this administration and with Congress to stress the relationship between security and rights in the Indo-Pacific region. And here, I'm not a Middle Eastern expert. I can't speak to whether ISIS really has been defeated in Syria or Iraq, but you would be very hard-pressed to find an Asian leader that thinks that ISIS is dead in Asia. If anything, they are concerned about its fanning out more, fighters returning home, and establishing a Southeast Asian, particularly caliphate or presence. And here, I think we have something that even the U.S. Pacific Command can bring to their counterparts. And sidebar, I'm a big fan of U.S. Pacific Command, so I think they would be a good messenger. That particularly what is a gift to ISIS is a beleaguered or mistreated Muslim minority. And we have two examples in Southeast Asia, possibly more. One, of course, is the Uyghurs in China, and the other would be the Rohingya in Myanmar, currently in Bangladesh. And so I think there's a case to be made that there is a real security value in terms of addressing those rights infringements. Second is, and Francisco mentions this, that supporting regional initiatives is a very, very good idea. It's always a good idea. But here, I think Thailand has actually suggested that they might be of use in the Rohingya situation, and I think we should take Bangkok at its word for that for a couple of reasons. One is that they have a lot of experience with refugees, a lot of it, not of their choosing, but they also have some experience with the roadmaps that they have constructed when they were last ASEAN chair for Myanmar, and there is a strong fraternal relationship between the Thai military and the Myanmar military. They might actually listen to the Thais, particularly since, as we know, the military is currently in charge in Thailand. And so, even if the country does the right thing for the wrong reason, if they do the right thing, that's fine. And so, to the extent that Bangkok doesn't already have a crowded agenda, I think that there might be an opportunity this year to help them, to support them in anything that they would like to do on that. And lastly, here I would echo Congressman Yoho's enthusiasm for the BUILD Act. I think that it is very good for the United States, it's very good for the an opportunity also to bring in good governance and transparency, and that is something that Southeast Asians in particular, but other countries as well, are discovering is a problem with the One Belt, One Road initiative. And it's, I think, a good way to just bring in on the bias some of the principles of, if not democracy, then at least a fair and transparent government. And in that sense, I think we have to be realistic that the BUILD Act, as admirable as it is not enough to overturn the dynamic of infrastructure building in Asia. The United States is not going to be the primary infrastructure power in Asia. We are just way too priced out of that. We're just too expensive. But with a coalition of other countries, I think that we can make a real impact. And on the transparency, good governance side, our logical partner in that is Japan. And it also, I think, reinforces Japan as a power in the Indo-Pacific region that can in many ways support U.S. values as well. So I will stop there.
So thank you all. So we've laid a lot on the table, and let me turn it over to you now for some questions. I will note that one of the benefits of working with such an esteemed group is that because they're multidisciplinarians, they could speak in each other's lanes, and maybe during Q&A we'll get some of that. But let me turn this over to you. Yes, please. If you could wait for the microphone. If you could identify yourself and your affiliation, please.
Hi, I'm a graduate student from Georgetown University, Master of Science and Foreign Service. And I'm very happy to see Professor Logan and Professor Dapino is here. And I have a question for Professor Dapino about the Myanmar situation right now. There is a deadlock in Congress, especially concerning Senator McConnell. And on the other hand, President Trump is criticized of not taking enough steps. So how would you think there will be any steps that Congress could take to scourge this problem or find a new way to deal with it?
First of all, I'm not sure any administration would put that crisis at the top in the White House. And maybe that's a good thing. And I'm also, I think that we might be talking a little bit about apples and oranges too when we talk about some of the positions that are articulated, within the Congress. I think the Congress as a whole wants to see a very positive resolution of this. The main sticking point at this time is, can Myanmar and/or the international community guarantee the safe return of the 700,000 refugees in Bangladesh? And apparently the answer at this time is no, because there is an MOU between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and they simply won't go back. So I think the Congress can be quite useful for that. Now again, I don't want to oversell this, but you might remember that in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, Thailand had 300,000 Cambodians just inside their border that they initially first were reluctant to take. And that the United States in particular, I remember our Ambassador Mortar Bromowitz was very, very active on this at the time, basically encouraged the Thais to find a way to do that, and the way to do that at the time was through the United Nations. So I think that certainly continued advocacy on the Hill, but also looking to get over that initial hump of how are you going to protect these people to give them a safe return would be something that Congress could work on, quite usefully.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that? No? Question up here in the front.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Cole Crutchfield. I'm a postgrad student from VCU. My question goes to Professor Delpino. You said that Japan could front the BUILD Act that the United States is proposing. Was that your question, or?
No, actually, that's not what I said. But
well, I was curious, but anyway, wouldn't that create tension in the Asian region with China's Belt Road Initiative problem or this string of pearls? Wouldn't that create more conflict and anything else?
So let me expand that question just more broadly. Do you see any tension between BRI and the BUILD Act?
Isn't that the point? Did I miss something here? That is, I think, one of the unacknowledged concerns that both the United States, China, and to a lesser extent Australia, because Australia doesn't have quite the heft to back it up. I think that is one of the concerns they have. But specifically what I was talking about was on the good government. I'm not suggesting that Japan take over the Build Act. Obviously, that's our initiative. But I'm saying that the United States and Japan could join together in Asia for discussions about the good governance and transparency aspects of infrastructure. And that's in the Build Act already. And that is something that is, I think, an advantage that Japan has as well, because my reading, particularly from Southeast Asian governments, is that they do see Japan as being far more transparent, far more consistent in their negotiation and infrastructure packages. But yes, of course it would conflict with China, but I think that that's inevitable anyway. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe express some dissent on the Build Act thing. And everybody, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened in Congress in the last 5 years or something. My skepticism about the Build Act is that it was sold basically as cost-free because the U.S. gets all of its money back and risk-free. If we're going to deploy this sort of in pursuit of some sort of strategic goals vis-a-vis China, it's going to entail some risk. And so it's not going to be cost-free anymore. For instance, you've got to put it in risky places. You're not going to put it where companies want to go, because companies want to go to places where they can make a secure return on the dollar. And so if this works appropriately, you're going to be encouraging them to go places they wouldn't otherwise go, and in exchange for that, you're going to subsidize them to do that, right? That's going to incur risk. I think once the bureaucracy gets a hold of it, it's also not necessarily going to be strategically focused on China. So there could be a Starbucks chain in Buenos Aires that's going to get money under the Build Act. There's nothing in the Build Act that prohibits it from being deployed globally without any regard to anything that the Chinese are doing. So I guess just think of it as a bit of skepticism. I would take a look at it in a couple of years. What I understand is no money is even going to hit the street for a couple of years from the Build Act or money that's been leveraged by the Build Act. So look at it in a couple of years, see the list of projects, and see if it's truly been deployed in some sort of strategic way vis-a-vis the Chinese. I have my doubts.
So a quick intervention from Catherine and then Frank and Lindsay.
I actually agree with that. I'm not trying to oversell it. I'm just saying it presents us with an optical opportunity to push some of these issues through, like good governance. But in terms of
symbolism, for sure.
Well, for example, when Vice President Pence went out to Asia and talked about 60 billion, that you have to subtract what OPEC has already used up in that. You're looking more at 37 billion. So let's just make a big subtraction there, and it is worldwide. So no, I'm just saying that it gives us an entry point that we didn't have before. And as I said at the beginning, the United States is not going to be a major infrastructure player in Asia, but it gives us a seat at the table. So.
Let me keep some skepticism on the Belt Road Initiative. Every Chinese investment anywhere in the world is now seemingly part of the Belt Road Initiative. This is a sales job worthy of a Trump real estate deal. The Chinese are nothing if not great marketers when it comes to the Belt Road Initiative, because every possible investment is being lumped together. And the Chinese business people are also not stupid. They understand that if they want to sort of get a little bit of boost maybe from Beijing, that they should maybe label their initiative as part of the Belt Road Initiative. So count me as one of those people who is not so worried about the Belt Road Initiative as some kind of a strategic Marshall Plan by China that's going to undercut U.S. leverage and influence in the world. First of all, as Walter has pointed out, a lot of these initiatives under the BRI are in the marginal, latecomer countries where the investment climate is less advantageous, where the Chinese are sort of picking at scraps. Secondly, the United States has the opportunity, if we choose to compete very effectively in terms of fostering investment opportunities in these places, but it won't come risk-free. One of the things we could do is to join the AIIB. The South Koreans have. I think it's probably inevitable that at some point the United States and Japan will bite the bullet and go ahead and join on to the AI hype, which after all was a response to a demand-driven need for infrastructure projects and investment as much as it was a Beijing initiative to somehow wield political and economic influence. So, I'm not so worried. I just got back from Astana, Kazakhstan. And not every country is as well positioned as Kazakhstan is to be choosy about Chinese investments. But they're being very, very choosy, and I think we can have a little more confidence in the nations that are going to be part of Belt Road Initiative. If we are present and if we don't cede the economic field, many of those nations are going to say to Beijing, we're interested in your project, but here are the terms. And they're not just going to be slaves to Beijing's ambition.
Lindsay.
Thanks. I just wanted to add, and I agree with what Frank just said, on the Japan point. I think sometimes in the United States, there's been so much hype and there's been so much press around Belt and Road recently. We forget that Japan's a major player in infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, and they have been for quite some time. So it's not a new development. It's not like Japan's just getting in the game. And when you talk to folks in Southeast Asia, they make a big point. I was talking to a Thai friend the other day who said, well, you guys get really worried about this project that we, just gave to Beijing, but look, we're very particular. We gave one to the Japanese too. Right? So they are thinking actively about how to diversify the projects that they're signing up for. And so I think Japan is a really important player here. They're also chairing the G20, and they've made this idea of pushing for greater transparency and good governance, especially around debt financing, to be a big emphasis of their chairmanship. So to me, they are a natural ally that we ought to be paying a lot more attention to in this space.
Thank you. Questions. So let's take a tranche of questions. I've got 1, 2, 3. So the gray jacket. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you, everyone. It was a great presentation. I'm Xiang Shu from American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. My 2 short questions. First question is, I think, a topic that hasn't been mentioned so far, which is AI tech and technological advances in the Asia-Pacific region and what it entails for the United States. Because one can argue that the current race in artificial intelligence development is primarily led by the United States and China. And China has a huge advantage in this arena, being that now the dynamic of AI development has shifted from primarily expertise-driven to implementation-driven. And the Chinese market has a huge amount of data being generated, and Chinese companies like Huawei has a lot of market share and weight in this area. Now, that places China in a very strategic position in this Indo-Pacific region. In that, if we are talking about the future of this century is the Asian or Indo-Pacific century. So that makes China attractive as a partner. So what can the United States do in this area in terms of competing with China and soliciting partnership in the area, and make sure that we preserve not just a free and open Indo-Pacific, but free and open cyberspace and fair competition and participation.
Okay, thank you. Couple more questions. Yeah, we'll take them all together.
Hi, thank you all. I'm Rachel Curillo. I'm a writer, and I've lived, worked, played, and traveled in Southeast Asia over a spectrum of 25 years. And so my question is about travel. I'm directing it specifically to Ms. Ford, but if anyone else would like to chime in, how travel is used or projected to be used for engagement and relationship building, even like cultural diplomacy. The last time I was in Southeast Asia was a few years ago, and all of the young people that I met and worked with were building relations through travel, wanted to create travel agencies, were Airbnb-ing, and Airbnb is even in China with lots of lots of hosts in China. So if someone could speak to that, I'm listening.
And then we had a final question. Yep, Stanley.
Stanley Kober. I'd like to ask about the India part of the Indo-Pacific, because that's been neglected. You might have noticed that a day or so ago, Indian aircraft bombed Pakistan. I'm now reading that Pakistani aircraft have crossed the line of control, bombed in India. This situation seems to be escalating. How would a conflict between India and Pakistan affect the Indo-Pacific strategy?
So would anybody like to take the first question?
I can try, yeah. It's sort of trade economic related question. So I guess fundamentally it's how the U.S. can maintain its position on, competitive position on advanced technologies and that sort of thing. You know, I'm from the Heritage Foundation, so it probably won't surprise you. I don't think the government should get involved in promoting R&D and that sort of thing for tech companies. Silicon Valley is done just fine without the U.S. Doing that. In fact, it's the government that is turning increasingly to Silicon Valley to look at solutions for some of these problems. I think, one, we need to keep markets as open as we can and expand them in terms of trade policy. You know, it's not just China in the region, it's Japan and South Korea, and South Korean and Japanese supply chains throughout the region, Chinese focused supply chains that are important. Taiwan is a really critical node in development of technology. So keeping open those supply chain, value chains, and expanding them, I think would be helpful. And the second thing is, I think we need to have some constructive progress in our relationship with the Chinese on these trade issues. And I try to put it very carefully because I don't want to say a solution, because we're not going to get to a solution immediately. We're going to get to some sort of down payment on a solution that we can continue to work through in the coming years. But the worst thing that we can do is what some people out there are advocating, is basically a complete decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies. First of all, not really feasible. But even if it were, it would be incredibly damaging to the American competitive position in the region and the availability of technology both to producers of the United States and consumers.
Catherine, quick follow-up.
Yeah, this is not a technical or economic response, but it's a good way to slip in the fact that Congress has been fairly active on hauling social media to account. And we have, and now in Southeast Asia in 2017, a reversal of what communications had been doing before, which is if you look at fax and internet and cell phone, impact on the region, oftentimes they promoted freedom and democratization. Here in 2017, you saw Facebook being used to promote communal tensions and violence in Rakhine State. And so there was enough pressure on Facebook to make them then take down some of the military's accounts and to say that they would monitor Myanmar. But they said this is going to be a one-country policy only. We're not going to do that with our other accounts in the region. Well, I think that could be extended with some pressure from Congress, if, as part of their own concerns that they have had about the use of social media.
Lindsay, you want to take the travel to Southeast Asia question?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm just going to add one thing on the AI front as well. I think we need to be really careful in the U.S. when we're having this conversation about, some of the dangers and the need to sort of decouple on the technological side. We need to be very realistic about how well that argument may work with certain countries. Southeast Asian governments are not going to stop using Huawei. Unfortunately, we may really not like that, but it's the reality, and for the most part, there's a pretty obvious reason why, and it's because it's cheaper. It's cheaper than what we're offering. So why would we think countries are going to do things that they see as fundamentally, not in their self-interest and for some that they just flat out can't afford. So in the United States, I think, if we really want to be pushing countries on sort of good governance and use of tech that maintains a more open cyber domain, we need to be offering them alternatives that actually work for them, because it's not really plausible just to tell people don't do this, but there's nothing else to really make available to you. On travel, on the idea of cultural diplomacy, I mean, look, overall, I think the more that people, here in Southeast Asia can travel and experience the other regions, that's good. I think people-to-people ties are really important. I guess I'll take more the cultural diplomacy side. I said in my remarks that I think that the Waisili program has been one of the most successful things that the United States has done in Southeast Asia in a while. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in sort of that soft power cultural diplomacy space. Soft power has been one of the United States' greatest advantages in this part of the world for a really long time, and I think we are sort of squandering it right now.
And then final question, where does India fit within the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Let me take a gander at that. On the other two questions, just really briefly, on AI, we ought to be doing more with Japan. The United States and Japan have a lead still over China. I take the gentleman's point about implementation-driven sort of advances in AI. I think it's a very important observation. And I think it will give China some increasingly relevant advantages over time. But when you look at educational institutions, when you look at innovation, when you look at the freedom of information that is inherent to successful advanced scientific work, the United States still has a great advantage, but we're not necessarily pushing it as well as we should. And I don't disagree with Walter. I'm not at Heritage, but I don't disagree with Walter about the government trying to pick winners and losers or trying to get into this. But I do think that there's a role for government in terms of basic R&D money and its STEM education spending and trying to advance us, in those sciences. And we should be doing more with like-minded partners. And travel, I just want to say that, the Chinese now are the travel way of the future. So every little Ryokon operator I know in Japan is learning Chinese, adding Chinese kanji to their, the hanzi to their menus, learning a few phrases, because they want those Chinese visitors who are coming by the millions now to Japan. And we are on the cusp of one of the greatest travel binges that the planet has ever seen, with hundreds of millions of Chinese who will be traveling around the world. And they are going to dwarf everyone in the numbers. And so every little Southeast Asian country is going to be preparing for that onslaught. And it's a good thing. It's going to stress countries, including Japan. But it's a good thing. Travel is good. It opens eyes, ears, cultural awareness, people to people, all of that. But I think it's going to be all about China. Now, India, Pakistan. When I worked for Senator Biden, as concerned as we always were about North Korea's nuclear ambitions, the most dangerous nuclear-armed country on the planet, without question, is Pakistan. That is the real threat of nuclear war on the planet. It's not on the Korean Peninsula. It's between India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed adversaries with a very important and strategically significant territorial dispute in Kashmir, historical animosities, poor governance in Pakistan, poor democratic institutions, a military in Pakistan that is not subordinate to civilian control, and an Indian government in the hands of a Hindu nationalist leader who is not like his predecessors. I'm extremely concerned about the growing escalation of the tension between India and Pakistan. I'm stunned by the deafening silence of the U.S. government on the issue, notwithstanding the fact that the president is otherwise occupied at the moment in Hanoi. We have a government that should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and someone in Washington, I hope, is desperately on the phone already, trying to calm that situation down. If they're not, they should be fired. But the situation is dangerously getting worse, not better. and has the potential to escalate to nuclear war. So yeah, let's pay attention to it. I don't have any solutions to the Kashmir situation. There's a reason why it's been unresolved for 50 years. The UN has peacekeeping forces that are deployed along parts of that border. But we need to be energizing international diplomacy right away to try to calm the situation down before it gets desperately out of hand.
Can I speak a quick comment?
Sure, and then, or Catherine first. And then
Actually, we can just go down the line.
yeah, if it's on this, yeah.
On the Pakistan issue, I think it's important for the Indians to keep their eye on the ball, basically. India is involved in all of these free and open Indo-Pacific ideas, the Quad, et cetera. It's all predicated on it keeping Pakistan in the past. I mean, the Indo-Pakistan conflict is really something that India is behind India. I mean, India is an emerging global power. It's not in the same category anymore as Pakistan. And they've got to remember that, I think, as they calibrate their reaction. That for Pakistan to pull it back into this conflict will only handicap it in evolving in the Pacific or in any of these Indo-Pacific ideas. So I think the Indians just need to keep their eye on the ball and not let the Pakistanis drag them back.
Catherine, do you want to weigh on this?
I think that was a very important question, and the question, as I understand it, was in the context of the Indo-Pacific region, where does the India-Pakistan conflict fit in? And I think the answer to that, as far as I can tell, is as far as the architects of the Indo-Pacific region are concerned, they don't want it to fit in at all. That the Indo-Pacific region stops with India for the strategic purposes of East Asians and the United States, in that it is a frontier, a strategic frontier. I think it expresses a fair amount of concern about the Bay of Bengal and conflict moving there, but I think that in a sense, India is almost included because they are punching below their weight in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, and can, at least in the Indo-Pacific context, be depended upon to stay that way for a while. So I don't think that any of the proponents of the Indo-Pacific region would want to take that on, and it would take steps to keep it out of that.
So we've had a in-depth and wide-ranging discussion. Let me thank our panelists for giving us a lot to chew on. I'm sure both the Hill and the administration misses their presence and their insights. Hopefully, and I think many of them are staying actively involved in informing the policy. One quick housekeeping matter. So we'll break for 10 minutes for coffee, and then we'll move on to the next portion of our program. But please join me in thanking our illustrious panel for their